that actually worked. That was a military-funded program, but we can get to that in a second.
But that's not related to this.
Right. So that's a very fair observation. In other words, the $200 million program to predict and preempt the pandemic failed. To predict and preempt the pandemic, but it may have also sparked the pandemic.
May have sparked, but
Exactly.
my question. When I read all about the research they were doing, I didn't see what they were doing to prevent it. I just saw what they were doing was examining these viruses and trying to find out how they work and trying to see what happens when they get more virulent. But what I didn't see is that the invention of therapeutics.
I hear what you're saying. I'm willing to give these scientists the benefit of the doubt that their honest goal was to do good science to prevent and predict.
Oh, I am too. That's not what I'm saying.
I don't know if they produce therapeutics.
What I'm saying, but did they have a lack of funding in that department? Was all the funding
I don't know.
Allocated towards examining the viruses themselves and not towards developing some sort of a therapeutic?
I don't. It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
But what I do know is that the majority of their time was spent digging up viruses in the wild and bringing them back to these labs.
But Fauci, when he started it back up, did he start it back up with the intent to just uncover more information so we'll be better informed?
His argument was, this is vital research. The longer we pause it, the more danger that we're in. I'm trying to save the world. And so we got to turn this stuff back on because this is how we're going to save the world from the next pandemic, which I'm sure he believed. A lot of these people believed. But there is another school of thought out there. And the other school of thought is, hey, instead of taking $200 million to dig up viruses and make them more dangerous, why don't you put that money into monitoring and surveillance in the places where the bats are? In other words, if you put resources where the outbreaks are likely to occur, then you can squelch them when they pop up, because actually viruses change every day, and trying to predict the pandemic is a fool's errand. That's another scientific school of thought. That's not the one that Fauci's in.
Right.
But the reason that there's no debate about this is because the NIH and NIAID structure are such that everyone gets funded by them. They're funding everybody. So if you are in the field of virology, there's 9.99% chance getting money from Anthony Fauci in one way or another. Your grants, your careers, your chairmanships. So there's no dissent allowed in that community. I learned a lot about scientific community and the virology
no
community.
No dissent allowed. So no debate.
I talk to scientists all the time who say, I think this gain of function research is really dangerous. I can't say anything. I'm going to lose my grant. I'm going to lose my career. This happens to me all the time. And when Robert Redfield spoke up, because he's a big macher and he's head of the CDC, he said it's my opinion that it came from the lab, because he can't declassify a bunch of classified information on CNN. Right. But he's talking about what he knows, right? It's obvious to everyone who's in the know that he's seen the intelligence, and he's not just talking out of his ass. He's not some Joe Schmo virologist. He was the head of the CDC. He's seen all of the secret stuff, even the stuff I never got a whiff of. And he went on TV and said, hey, I think this probably came from the lab. We should probably look at the lab. And he was called a racist and a conspiracy theorist.
But by foolish
what
people.
He's saying,
but Fauci's disagreed with him publicly.
Right. So that's the thing. So if you just think about it, just for once, again, I'm begging people out there, just like, think again. Whatever you thought about the accident, it doesn't matter. Whatever you tweeted in 2020 March, nobody cares, right? And the same thing for the media.
Let it go, yeah.
Because it's all nation bias now. Like, oh, I said tweeted this in March 2020, and nobody cares what you tweeted in March 2020. Let's just have a rational
moratorium
conversation about what are the likely ways we got into this horrible crisis that we're in. And so for people in the know who are listening to Robert Redfield, it's clear that he's calling out Anthony Fauci. In other words, he's pointing to the gain of function research, which he knows because he's the head of the CDC, reports up to Fauci. He knows that, right?
Right.
But he's saying that because even that's too hot for him to say. It's hot, and the scientists are not going to say that either. Now you have a lot of people sort of on the right-wing media and the MAGA media who've been saying that for a long time, but they don't have any credibility with the mainstream media. And I'm just like in that weird space. Like I wrote a book about, U.S.-China relationship, so I had all this good report in MAGA media because I criticize Trump in my columns all the time. So I am mainstream media, but I'm saying we should look at the lab, and it messes with people's minds because they're like, oh, why is he doing this? Why is Josh pushing the lab? I'm not pushing the lab.
That's the problem today with these rigid ideologies.
Exactly. Everyone's on teams. It's all factional. But I don't care. I don't even care if the lab accident theory is true. If the natural origin theory is true, then great. I will be the ticker tape parade celebrating Peter Daszak and Anthony Fauci down, Fifth Avenue. I'm happy to. All I'm saying is that we have to also look into these labs, and that we can't hire the best friends of the lab to look into the labs because they have a clear conflict of interest and they fucked it up already.
What is the argument?
Is that so crazy? Does that make me a crazy person?
No, listen, I'm on your side. I don't think it's crazy at all.
I've converted you. Well, Jamie converted you, but I'm confirming it. We have to be able to talk about this.
Yes. Yes, we have to be able to talk about this, and that is part of the problem. What is the compelling against the lab leak theory? Do they have one?
That's fair. Yeah. So there's two things: argument and there's evidence. So the most compelling argument that I've heard for the natural spillover is that most of the pandemics, or most of them, have been from natural spillover. The vast majority of them.
Right.
That's a statistical argument. Now, that doesn't speak to this pandemic because statistics are just statistics. It doesn't tell you. It's not data, right? It's not actual. So that's one thing. Like SARS spilled over naturally. Now, I would say to that, SARS spilled over naturally. The bats are.
Right.
Not 1,000 miles where the labs are. Which should tell you something, right? Or a palm civet or a raccoon dog or whatever.
Right.
And then what Peter Daszak will say on TV, who says all the time, is, oh, well, we know that the market, the market, they call it a wet market, it's just a market. You know, you go to Asia, there's markets everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the market had the animals that could have been the pass-through animals. In other words, they had pangolins in the market. To me, that's not it either. It's just, again, a plausible theory. Now, why is it that despite a year of searching for every pangolin and palm civet and mink and raccoon dog from, Kathmandu to Kabul, Peter Daszak and his friends never found any pangolins linked to the outbreak, right? There's no...
Yeah, that's what I was going to get at.
So this is another trope, and this is a trope that, we have an opportunity to actually fix right here in this moment, which is that, and this is all... It's crazy when this is written into news stories because it's not true, which is that you'll see there's no evidence of the lab leak theory, and there's lots of evidence of the natural spillover theory. That's what objective journalists will write into their news stories because they've been writing that for a year and they never thought about it really for more than 2 seconds or whatever. And the truth is that, I think there's much more evidence to be sure of the lab leak theory. But either way, if there's no evidence, then you have to admit that there's no evidence of either theory. In other words, we don't know shit. Okay? There's no proof. In other words, there's no animal that linked market. By the way, the Chinese CDC disavowed the market theory in May 2020. Nobody cared. Nobody noticed. The Chinese CDC, they said it didn't come from the market. The market was an amplifying event, not an origin event. Some people went to the market. They found some people who had it before. The first people that they found that had it, and they never went. They didn't know anything about the market. So again, and then you have. I think it's very plausible that this spilled over in nature. It's also very plausible that it spilled over into the lab. That it was the result of gain-of-function research gone awry at the lab. You have to investigate them both.
Right.
And that's. I think. I can't understand. I understand why that's a contradiction to say, but it ought not to be.
Well, what is the argument about the natural?
And then there's the popsicle theory. Did you know about the popsicle theory?
No, what's that?
That's fine. So after a year of we're not talking about the elephant in the room, which is really the most important thing, which is the CCP, which is the Chinese, which is lording over all of this, right? Because it's impossible to talk about this without talking about the fact that the Chinese government has had a year-long campaign to cover up origin, to squelch the science, to jail and disappear anyone who said anything that wasn't the party line, and then to use the scientists who are the best friends of the lab to launder a bunch of really horrendous disinformation. Okay, and that's not to say that this makes sense. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they have an overlapping interest. If you don't want the lab thing to be true, and if you're the Chinese government thing to be true, you have an overlapping interest. It's not like they're not colluding, they're not working together. They just happen to say the same exact thing. Okay, and the case of the WHO report, they actually did work directly together. And what they say is that, okay, well, if we can't find the palm civet, that made the 1,000-mile walk from Yunnan to Wuhan without spilling over once until it got to the lab doorstep, maybe it came on a frozen food package from Norway. Well, let's go check every food package distributor point that shipped any box into Wuhan in the 4 months before the outbreak.
Why frozen food?
It's the Chinese government came up with another explanation. If it wasn't the market and it wasn't the lab, well, maybe the virus was on the box of frozen food that came from Norway.
Why Norway?
I'm just saying it could come from anywhere. In other words, or maybe it came from, Japan or Thailand
so
or anywhere.
They don't have an origin.
It's a bullshit. Is what I'm trying to say, because it's a crazy thing to say.
Right.
Because it doesn't pass the laugh test. All right. Forget about Occam's razor. I'm talking about the leftists. When you hear something, can you think about that being true without cracking up in your mind? Okay, it doesn't pass because, what that would lead you to is to searching every frozen food package that's ever been shipped into Wuhan, which creates years of busy work that leads you to no conclusion whatsoever. But the Chinese government loves this because for the CCP, confusion is enough, right? They don't need to find the source. They just need to make sure we don't find the source. They control their information environment. Their people have no choice but to hear the things that they say, and anyone who says something different disappears. They're working on information environment. This is part of the influence part of the book, right? They're trying to change our discussion by getting into our information space and corrupting it for their own ways. And in this case, it has a direct effect on public health, because we need to figure this out so we can figure out how to prevent the next one. So this is again, I'm not saying the scientists are working with them. I'm just saying the line that they're pushing is the same line now being pushed by these same exact scientists, which would only lead you to searching every frozen food package that ever came into Wuhan in the last 2 years, which is crazy, which is another way to distract us from the thing that we need to do, which is just to take a look at these labs.
Did anybody question this frozen food narrative?
I mean, it got ridiculed on the internet, but these,
but these scientists are not ridiculing it. They're not saying, "Hey, this doesn't even make sense."
They're pushing it. So the ones that are talking are pushing it.
But why frozen food? This is what I'm concerned with.
How many ways? In other words, the Chinese government wants us to believe. So again, they're trying to avoid blame because they're trying to avoid liability.
Right.
3 million deaths.
Right.
No statute of limitations on 3 million deaths.
Right.
Every one of those coffins comes with a lawyer. Okay.
Yeah.
They're thinking. We're thinking about, should we wear masks or could I go out to a bar tonight? The Chinese get-go has been way ahead of us in looking forward to the next stages of this crisis. The disease is only the first stage. There's going to be broad economic upheaval, doing vaccine diplomacy on a broad scale. Right? They're using vaccines to blackmail and bribe countries all over the world. We're not playing a game, right? Then thinking about, okay, what's the legal liability of us for this thing? Do they want to close down their own labs? No, they don't want to do that. They've got their own interests. So they have many, many reasons to distract us from the real mission of finding the source of this virus. Now, some people, you just want to blame China. But here's the crazy part. If the lab accident theory turns out to be true, and again, we don't know, I don't know, my wife doesn't know, my parents don't know, but if it does turn out to be true, it doesn't just implicate China, okay? The big reveal of the lab accident theory is that it implicates us, that it points the finger back at us, because we're the ones who sponsored that research. We're the ones who built up this industry. We're the ones who, it was mostly the French, but who built this lab in China in the first place, okay? We had this bet on China, and this sort of fits into the broader U.S.-China relationship, which is the bigger scope of the book, that if we just engage with China as much as we could and help them out as much as we could, that engagement and cooperation would in turn convince them to liberalize, first economically and then politically, and then we could avoid the Cold War and we would all live in peace and happiness. That was the basic, I'm simplifying it to be sure, stance of U.S. foreign policy towards China since 1972. Okay, and scientific cooperation was held up as the bastion of that, because if you can't cooperate on stopping a pandemic, what could you cooperate on?
Right.
But the problem is that the Chinese government doesn't think that way, and they don't see it that way, and they're not liberalizing, and it's becoming increasingly obvious to everyone. Slowly but surely, and over the course of the Trump administration, more and more parts of American society sort of realize this idea that, oh wait, they're weaponizing their engagement against us for their interests, which are adverse to ours, that they wish us harm, in other words. Not the Chinese people, I'm talking about the party, not even the Chinese government, the party, right, which operates like a cartel. It's like the Gambino family if they ran the largest country in the world, okay? That's what it is, okay? And they have factions, and they kill each other, and they're secretive, and they're more scared of each other than anyone else because they're constantly killing each other.
Really?
Oh yeah, it's vicious. I mean, it's just like the mafia. If you get too famous, you get whacked. It happens all the time. Just look what happened to Jack Ma and Alibaba, right?
But Jack Ma, he's still alive, right? Or not him?
He did better than most. The head of Angbang Insurance Group, the guy who met with Jared Kushner in 2018, they tried to work out that alleged corruption, an 18-year prison sentence. The head of Angbang HNA, which is like a multinational conglomerate, he fell off like a 4-foot wall twice. just to make sure. There's this, if you Google like China and like people like falling out of windows, like what did they not screw the windows in, right? People constantly, famous businessmen constantly falling out of windows. There's like they're very nasty to each other, but that's, again, if you think of it just like a mafia family, that's sort of how it operates. Like they're working together, and Xi Jinping is the head of it. Now, what it means for us is that to the issue at hand is that our scientific collaboration may be with these Chinese scientists who are very nice people who also want to solve the pandemic, who dedicated their life to solving pandemics, and that's what they've been doing for 20 years. They don't make the decision. Okay, they've got a party guy standing over their shoulder, who's got a general standing over his shoulder, who's got another party guy standing over his shoulder, who's got Xi Jinping standing over his shoulder, and that's what a lot of Americans don't understand. Like, I thought we were just doing open science. What could be bad about that? What, they're going to hide stuff in the labs? Why would they do that? But for the people inside the government who understood how the CCP rates, of course, it's what they would do. And for the people who saw how they responded to the SARS virus in 2003, that's exactly what they did. They did the same things. They did it over again. Just this time, it killed 600,000 Americans. Now, again, that doesn't excuse our poor response. That doesn't excuse any of the bullshit that Trump put us through that made it much worse. I'm just saying there's plenty of blame to go around. What that tells us about our relationship with China, again, not Chinese people. You wouldn't blame Italian people for the mafia, so you wouldn't blame the Chinese people for the CCP, right? But what it tells us is that this is an organization that has to be viewed with clear eyes. And the clear eyes are that they covered up the origin, they covered up the science, they still won't give us the data that they have to this day. And this is having a direct effect on our security and our prosperity and our public health. And so we're going to have to do something about that. And what I say is that we have to start here. We have to start investigating our labs, the gain-of-function research that we're doing here. You see that happening a little bit now. You see some congressmen, some more scientists like Jamie Metzl, by the way, took a lot of shit, man, when he started talking about the lab accident theory a year ago. He was, he attacked all the time. Me too, to a lesser extent, but like, I'm a journalist. Like, that comes with the territory.
That was one of the problems with Trump, is that everything that he endured was problematic.
Exactly.
Even if it didn't make any sense to oppose it, people opposed it just based on the fact that it was his.
Exactly. And but I don't like being on Trump's side any more than anyone else. You know what I mean?
You're not on his side. You're on the truth.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's and I like the way you just your way through this. It was brilliant. The thing that scares me terribly is that there's still people, despite the fact that this evidence is slowly emerging, there's still people that are ideologically opposed to it being true. So they're fighting it hook, line, and sinker.
Here's what I say to those people. The origin of the coronavirus is not a political question.
Right.
It's not an ideological question. In fact, it's not even really a scientific question. It's a forensic question. Something bad happened. We need to find out what happened.
Right.
It's not for scientists to solve. It's for forensic investigators to solve.
And we're actually impeding that investigation with this adherence, this blind adherence to ideology.
Of course.
That's what's dangerous. That's what scares me.
And it's getting worse because we're a year and a half into this thing and we don't know shit. Oh, here's another angle, which is like, will help you understand the intelligence community, right? Our vaulted $80 billion intelligence community. $80 billion, okay? Now, you'll notice, and a lot of people point this out, that when I started publishing about these cables, and then the scientists came back and were like, oh, you can't talk about the lab accident theory. Don't look at the lab. We went to the lab. We talked to the scientists. They said they were innocent. And case closed. And shut up, When that happened, the intelligence community leaked to the mainstream press. There was no evidence to support the lab. That's where this no evidence thing came from, right? Now, because I was sort of inside the system and I was writing the book and I actually had like real no shit sources, I was able to sort of trace how that happened. And, there was a gap. There was an intelligence gap. In other words, what happened was a guy by the name of Matthew Pottinger, who was the deputy national security advisor at the time, who spoke Chinese, who used to work as a Wall Street Journal reporter. He was a Marine intelligence guy, really interesting guy. Wife is a virologist. His brother is an epidemiologist. He was reading Chinese social media. He was in the know. He was at the nexus of all this information. And for that reason, he was like the early warning system inside the government and for Trump and along with a couple other people. But he was mostly ignored and shouted down by the political people, right? Because they're like, how dare you close the economy? What are you gonna shut down travel from Europe in the middle of an election season? That's crazy. You're gonna lose the election. Now, of course, the political people were 100% wrong, because if Trump had done a better response, he might have won the election, and his failed response actually lost him the presidency when he realized he didn't know what he was doing. But at that moment, guys, Matthew Pottinger were like, hey, we really think this came from the lab. The intelligence people, who also didn't like, some of them anyway, who didn't like the Trump people, leaked there was no evidence to fuck with the Trump people, and the mainstream media ran with it, because, like, isn't it great to fuck with the Trump people?
They leaked it, or they decided to run with that narrative to fuck with the Trump people? Because it's not a leak if they knew it wasn't factual.
No, it's factual, but it's misleading.
Right, I see what you're saying.
You know,
there is no evidence.
There's no evidence either way.
Right,
They could have leaked. There's no evidence of the natural spillover, but they leaked. There's no evidence. They were rebutting what Pompeo and Trump were saying, and so you know, people talk about, you know, like, I'm not going to use the term deep state, but like, this was attempt by them to reset the narrative, or somebody in the intelligence community, a bunch of people. But what had actually happened was that Pottinger went and he said, "What do you have? Okay, give me the SIG, give me the satellite shit. Do we have any human sources on the ground? We got everything." He didn't say, "Go prove the lab theory." He said, "Give me everything on every theory. If you got the theory, smoking gun, give me that too." And so he put out this sort of tasking, which is what they do at the White House, and give me everything you got. And there wasn't anything. They didn't know shit. They still don't know shit. And this doesn't blow your mind, nothing will. Think about the intelligence failure that represents. Just think about for a second that, you know, after 9/11, we took our $80 billion intelligence community machine and shifted it over to the jihadis, you know, and then we shifted it back to Russia, and then we took some of it, we shifted it to like China, like spies, like people trying to honey trap mayors and stuff like that. That's what they do. They'll throw a bunch of Chinese spies at American mayors to try to get them to fuck them, and then they're compromised, you know, like old craft. Nobody was looking at this universe of risky research that was going on in this network of labs that did involve the military of China. They weren't pointed at it, and that's where the pandemic hit. So we're always looking we're always fighting the last war. We're always looking under the lamppost for our keys. You know what I mean? But then something happens, and then Pottinger goes and he's like, "Hey, what do we have on these labs?" Like, we don't have shit. And then they leak, "Oh, there's no evidence for the lab theory." And it was like, "Oh, Trump is wrong. Let's have a party." And a year later,
what a failure.
Huge intelligence, massive intelligence failure. In any sane world, you would have a commission, you know, like a 9/11 style commission would be like, how did this happen? Not just how did this happen? How did we get this dystopian, crazy reality that we're all suffering in? Not just Americans, 7 billion people suffering to this day, much worse than us.
Yeah.
You know, in a lot of countries, much worse than us. And no one's curious, no one cares. Like, there's like 2 Republican, you know, committees that are like issued letters on this. That's all I could ever find. A year later, 0 Democrats are interested in this. I mean, there's a few people in the media, not really, you know, a couple, you know, they're doing their best. I'm doing my best. I can't, you know, I don't know. Nobody listens to me. What are you going to do?
We're going to listen to you.
We'll see.
It's just one of those things where
I'm going to listen to you. If I can convince you that'd be like a watershed moment in this conversation.
Well, I've been aware because of Jamie and because of many other people that the whole way it was established that it was a natural spillover was very faulty, but not to the extent that you're laying it out here today.
I'm taking you a couple more layers down into the system to tell you what was going on inside the beast. And again, I'm just blurting it all out because I don't have an agenda. I don't care how I'll tell you what I know. I'll tell you what I don't know. And what I know is that from jump, there were a lot of very serious people who wanted to look into this lab, and for a number of fucked up reasons that we've just discussed, it's still not happening. To this day, it's still not happening. Yeah. There's no plan. No one's even really, I haven't heard anybody come up with a plan for it. How is that? How is nobody more curious about how we got into this mess? By the way, now I'm really going to blow your mind. Guess what the plan is to respond to the pandemic, the official international government plan, scientifically. Guess.
What's the plan?
Just guess.
I don't know.
To take this gain of function research and to times it by 6.
What? Really?
Let that thing sink in for 1 second.
Really?
It's called the Global Viral Project. To take this $200 million program to predict and preempt the pandemic, which didn't predict and preempt, which may have sparked the pandemic. We don't know, but may have. And to dump another $1.2 billion into it, so a lot of which is U.S. taxpayer money, to take the Fauci-Daszak project and just make it huge, much bigger. According to the website, to dig up 500,000 new dangerous viruses from the wild to bring back to labs. That's our current response plan. Now, don't you think?
Who's initiating this?
It's an international consortium of scientists. It's like from many countries.
Do you think they're taking advantage of the fact that there is this need for an understanding how to fix some of this, a situation like this, if it were to occur in the future? They're doubling down.
They're sextupling down,
right,
on their mistake, if it's a mistake. But all shouldn't we find out before we increase this research sixfold? If it is, and here's the other thing: even if it didn't cause the pandemic, there's a risk, right? So when the WHO releases its report, the test report says we went to the lab 3 hours. They told us they didn't do it. We said sorry to bother you, and case closed. As they're releasing that report, the head of the WHO, who most right-wing outlets accuse of being like totally compromised by the CCP. Again, I don't think that's the case. I think he has a conflict of interest. I think he's, again.
Is that the guy that was in that interview with the journalist refused to say the name Taiwan?
No, that's different. I think that was a different guy. But that's that's another part of the problem, is the self-censorship that goes on in these organizations. View on the WHO's, we should fix it, not nix it. In other words, these organizations are flawed, but if we destroyed them, we just have to build them again. So we should probably engage it, not get rid of it. Anyway, he comes out in the speech, in the release of the report. Guess what he says? He says, we got to look at this lab. And you guys didn't do enough to look at the lab. In other words, he crapped on his own report in the middle of releasing the report.
Wow.
Now, again, if you're just as a curious human being, I'm like, oh, why would he do that? Well, he was trying to save his credibility and the credibility of his organization. Now it seems pretty clear and obvious to more and more people that we're going to have to take a look at these labs.
So as time goes on, the investigation will reveal more of this. More people start looking into it now that it's no longer taboo. Now that Trump's not in office.
I don't know. Maybe, what I find is that, I could, because I haven't been having a lot of these conversations, is that, again, when people come to this issue without all that baggage, we have this kind of rational conversation that you and I are having right now. But when people come to it with the baggage that they had from 2020, it immediately descends into oh wait, I tweeted this in March 2020, and this is why I think this is still right.
I have to defend it.
It's fucking maddening, and I'm a pretty laid back guy, as you can tell. You know what I mean? I'm not into Twitter, but I had to get a couple Twitter wars over this because I couldn't help myself. I'm not gonna call out any names. You know who you are. But they were very famous people, people much more famous than me, who were like, oh no, this is all conspiracy. I was like, hey guys, we got to come together on this thing. We got to think again. Have you ever heard of this book, Think Again, by Adam Grant?
No.
You should have him on the show.
I would love to.
He's a behavior scientist. I don't know if that's his real title, at Penn, and he wrote this great book, and it says that, what we were lacking in our politics and in our discourse in our society is the ability to challenge our own assumptions, and that when new information comes in, and to have some sort of constructive disagreement and testing where we can allow ourselves to be wrong, because the important thing is not to be right first. The important thing is to be the end, right? You want to be right when the chips are all down. You want to be right at the conclusion of it.
Yes. And
so in order to do that, you have to be willing to admit that you might have been wrong in the beginning. And when the new information comes in, you have to rethink your assumptions and rethink. It's more of a scientific method to thinking, but because journalists are the way we are, being right is an end in of itself. So we get obsessed with that. And then, of course, for the mainstream media, if you're wrong, you get dunked on by the right-wing media, right? But if you're the right-wing media, you're wrong. There's not really that many consequences. So for the mainstream media guys like me, we're always on edge because we got to be right 100% of the time. And if they catch us once being wrong, then that's a huge damage to our credibility. And don't get me wrong, I believe that we should be held to that higher standard. I believe that journalists, because we're out there calling people out for their shit all day long.
Right.
So yes, I agree, but I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. I've made mistakes. If you watch some of the YouTube videos about, you will see there have been mistakes have been made. I'm not a perfect journalist, but I'm trying to get it right. And that's the integrity, is not worrying about whether or not getting it right means that I was wrong the first time.
It's your intent. Your intent is to get it right, not to obfuscate, not to cover up your past mistakes by ignoring data that's contrary to
but
that.
It's tough because people have bias.
Of course.
And it's a real thing, and you have to think about it. People have source bias. You know what I mean? Imagine you're covering the pandemic, and those scientists are your source.
Right.
That's what happened.
Yeah.
The guys on 60 Minutes.
There's this the double, triple, quadruple, whatever they're doing with the gain of function research scares shit out of me, because has this been approved? Is this just a plan?
No, they've been doing it for 15 years.
No. Now, with knowing the response, knowing what happened.
The Global Virome Project. So the Global Virome Project, which is a $1.2 billion expansion of the gain, not just function research, but the overall industry of collecting viruses from the wild. Yeah. Some of which is gain of function research. They may do lots of different things with these viruses. But the idea is like, let's go to every cave in Yunnan and Indonesia, find the worst viruses that we can. When we find a really bad one, that's great. We're going to bring it back to the lab and see what's what. That idea is still the current plan. I'm told that there are people looking at it. The funding hasn't actually gone out, but if you ask, that's still the current plan. In other words, there's not another plan.
But does it include treatments this time?
No. Well, I mean, that would be done by a different.
Right. But I mean, if you're examining all these, viruses, and they're doing what they did with these mice by passing it from one to another and seeing what's the most virulent strain, like what are you doing other than impact viruses? You're gaining an understanding, but what good is that gain of understanding if there's no significant treatments that are being developed simultaneously?
No, I'm sure that they have a plan to link that research with treatments and this and that.
But that was never done in Wuhan.
That's not that's not the part that would have been done in Wuhan.
Right, but they didn't link it to anyone and develop.
I'm not sure. As I said, I don't want to.
I understand. But they clearly didn't have a treatment.
Right, but where did the treatment come from? The treatment was mRNA vaccines.
But that's from the original SARS.
No,
right?
It's not. It's from what was originally a DARPA-funded defense program.
We were saying earlier.
Yeah. So think about that. So that was like a government investment in a new technology that it worked. The
mRNA vaccines.
Technology that was developed so that we could respond to any virus, not to respond to the coronavirus. The beauty of the mRNA technology is that you can apply it to the virus you don't know about.
Right.
Which is, again, is the big criticism of all of this National Virome Project, which the virus is changing all the time.
Right.
One virus changes every single day. So you could dig up 500,000 viruses. The next day, those 500,000 viruses will be different. So what are you really doing? Now, again, I'm not a scientist. I know that this is an honest debate inside the scientific community by people who think that this research, and whether or not it led to therapeutics, I don't know the details. Again, I got to be transparent about the limits of what I know everything about. But the bottom line is that argument, that scientific project, which I'm sure does include path towards therapeutics. How far they got, I'm not sure. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to take all that money, all of it, all these scientists, the whole industry, and do something different. And it's called mitigation, surveillance, prevention, like not prevention, pre-stocking of supplies. That when the outbreak happens, again, probably where the bats are, probably where the viruses live. I had to guess where the outbreaks are going to be, which is, again, a very weird thing about this one. It happened 1,000 miles away next to the lab. You could spend all that money. You probably save a lot more lives. That's the argument.
Well, other ones break out in central centers.
Yes. Yeah. There are, in other words, any theory that you have, you could point to an example. Right. But it doesn't matter because all we care about is this example.
Right.
Is the coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic, we're all in. That's the one we need to figure out.
Right.
So can we figure it out? Is it okay? Can I say that? Is it even if that involves asking tough questions of Anthony Fauci, who I'm sure, again, is a very nice man who dedicated his life to solving viruses. And if it turns out that his research helped spark the pandemic, well, okay, I'm not accusing him of doing illegal or wrong. He was going through the regular process. He was doing approved stuff, as far as we know.
But he wasn't personally doing it, right? He was doing it in a lab that was cited in 2018 for violations.
In many, many labs all over the world, including this lab in Wuhan. Now, the person I do think bears a little bit more responsibility is those people in the Chinese labs that were not doing the public research. And this is a new thing that I'm talking about now, which is that the Trump administration, again, in its Trumpian kind of way, on the very last week of existence, put out this statement on January 15th, making claims about the lab, bold claims. Okay, and they did a lot of shit in that last week. You know what I mean? Like the rioters came. You know what I mean? And then like they were like everything. It was very weird. You know, DC became a very fucked up place, and I've been living there 24 years. And
Capitol's still fenced in, right?
No, 75% fences are pretty secure, and for the first time last week it was very weird and very sad. And I attended quite accidentally the funeral of a Capitol police officer, the last one, you know, because now they're
Two guys that get hit by a car.
Yeah, and you know, it's tragic. You know, I spent a lot of time covering Capitol Hill. My wife covered it for a long time. You know, my wife could have been in that building that day if she hadn't switched jobs very recently. And you know, that shit is scary. And you know, walking around DC, it looked like, you know, the green zone. That's that hit me. It really affected me. But anyway, in that last week, in that confusion, they pushed through a lot of shit. And Pompeo came out with this statement saying, "Oh, well, we have all this declassified intelligence about the labs, that there were sick researchers at the lab, COVID-like symptoms in September and October 2019, that there was undisclosed coronavirus research at the lab that they didn't tell us about. They published some of it, but and that they were doing military work at the lab, again, that they didn't tell us about." Okay. Now, these are amongst some other claims, but these are the three big claims that Pompeo made. Now, of course, for understandable reasons, there's like, how dare you? Everyone comes Greta Thunberg. How dare you? How dare you, Mike Pompeo? And, you know, at the time I was like, well, you know, shocking if true, but I can't trust the Trump administration either because they have a habit of lying. So the Biden team comes in, and I gave them a couple of weeks to get set. I was like, hey, you got to check this out. Is this true? They put out these statements, and to their credit, they did. They checked it out, and they said, yeah, the facts are true. Now, what the Biden administration said, the State Department, Anthony Blinken's State Department said, we confirm these facts. In other words, our intelligence does in fact show that there were sick researchers at the lab, that there was undisclosed coronavirus research at the lab, and that there was some undisclosed military work at the lab. However, we do not agree with the Trump and Pompeo statement that the lab probably did it. Okay, that was their hedge, right? And if you think about it, the Biden people are being fair, you know, because they don't want to take a stance. They're like you. They were in 2020. They weren't there. They weren't in office. They don't care which way it turns out. They know it might be the lab. It might be the natural spillover. So they confirm the facts, but not the political assertions of the Trump administration. But just going that far, just to say that we confirm these facts, was significant. They didn't have to do that. They went and checked all of the intelligence, what we had, and said, yeah, there is this suspicious activity at the lab that we didn't previously know about. Okay, now nobody really, when the Biden administration, you know, releases lab accident theory data, no silence. You know, like Robert Redfield. I remember when Robert Redfield was like, hey, we should probably look at this lab. The New York Times headline said, Robert Redfield, former CDC director, pushes debunked theory.
Yeah.
I was like, wait a minute, who debunked it? Did I miss a meeting? You know what I mean? Because I just wrote a fucking book about it. I don't.
What do you think that's about? Why?
Confirmation bias and source bias.
Is that really all it is?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, I worked in the media 17 years. I worked for 8 different news organizations. It's mostly incompetence. It's not a conspiracy.
I don't mean a conspiracy.
What do you mean? You tell me what you mean.
But to say something that's so egregious, to say debunked when it hasn't been debunked.
Yeah.
Like what? There's got to be some sort of motivation to do that.
I mean, I think some of it is like orange mad.
Yes.
We can't let Trump be right. Like, guess what? The broken clock is right twice every fucking day. You know, you know. So I think a lot of it is that, like, oh, because again, you could say that Trump pushed it, right? He did say things. They did offer things without evidence. They made mistakes. He also merged racism and the origin story in a horribly destructive way, in the sense that we can't even untangle it. So now, if you're on the progressive side, this is why the progressives got mad at Redfield, because you're fueling AAPI, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, and I get why they think that, right? And I tried to write. I wrote a column about this where I basically just tried to elevate the voices of AAPI lawmakers.
You're saying Asian American Pacific Islanders?
Yes, exactly. Okay. So
most people don't know what the fuck you're saying.
Sorry about that. Okay. It's DC jargon. You know, argued is that, you know, it's a tragedy that Trump used the China issue to stoke anti-Asian hate, which is, I think, a fact, an undeniable fact. However, now that Trump is gone, we have to separate these two things. In other words, we can be critical of the Chinese Communist Party without being racist against Asian Americans. In fact, it's crucial that we do that because the Chinese Communist Party stokes our racial divides, including our anti-Asian, in order to divide our society, to undermine our democracy, to advance its own
How do they
interests.
do that?
Tons of propaganda and trolls, state media. You should have seen it. The first time, sure, the Counselor of China met with Tony Blinken. He criticized him about Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. Right? Why is he doing that in the diplomatic meeting, right? And if you look at their embassies and their state media, and it's a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, constantly pumping out, how does America treat its Asians? Look at this statistic, that statistic. Now that, in a sense, is a very clumsy kind of propaganda. That's what we can see, and it's increasing all the time. And again, with the Facebook groups, the whole thing, all the same shit the Russians did, okay? And drive a wedge into our society to inflame our existing tensions, again, to undermine our own confidence in our society and our democracy. Oh, look, democracies are so messy, but you have freedom of the press, but everyone's pushing fake news, and look at China, it's so wonderful. Like, there's a million newspapers, there's only one story, right? Yeah. There's only, you go to the bookstore, this is the book you need to read, that you better download it. And by the way, if you don't download it, we're going to ding your social credit score, And so that's the overt part. Then there's the influence part, which again is a big subject of the book, which is harder to talk about because it's less visible. And this is the seeding of American institutions with cash and favors and relationships that the Chinese Communist Party has definitely built over decades on both sides of our political spectrum, but also in our institutions, in academia, in Wall Street, especially in Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, in our sports, in Hollywood, okay? And you see it everywhere. And there are certain watershed moments where it pops into our public consciousness, and I'm talking about the NBA here, right? You had one guy, Daryl Morey, who I don't know if you know this, is a former DOD and CIA contractor and a MITRE researcher, a smart guy. He did like the Moneyball research. He's like a brilliant national security guy who happened to find himself as the manager of the Rockets while they're cracking down on Hong Kong. He sets one tweet, and the NBA is punished to the tune of $400 million. Canceled in China, made scandal.
And his tweet was just in support of the Hong Kong protesters. Is that what it was? Yeah.
One tweet. And they punished the entire industry. There's the big scandal in sports history, really. And all of a sudden, millions of people are like, wait a second, we can't tweet something? Our entire company, maybe the whole league? $400 million is nothing to sneeze at. And of course, the NBA, and this is kind of like what I argue in the book, they didn't know how to deal with that, okay? They didn't understand much like the American scientists, much like the American media, they didn't know what they were dealing with. So what Adam Silver did, quite tragically, was he went to the guy who he thought would have the best line on it, Joseph Tsai, the head of the Brooklyn Nets, who's like a CCP party member. He's like a kid-eating Taiwanese billionaire, but he's like, a chief promoter of the...
What did you call him? A kid-eating?
CCP party kid-eating.
What did you say?
No. That I never said kid-eating.
No, what did you say though after that? You said CCP member,
CCP party member,
and then you said something else.
Canadian Taiwanese.
Okay, you're talking so fast.
Okay, I gotta
sound like you're saying kid-eating Taiwanese billionaire. What?
For the record, I did not accuse Joseph Tsai of eating any.
We can cut that out. We'll cut out the confusion.
Leave it. I just want.
I was like so confused what you were saying.
Sorry.
Canadian.
Okay, so Joseph Tsai puts out this Facebook post, which basically is the Chinese Communist Party. You may not criticize Chinese policy. 1.4 billion Chinese people were super offended by that tweet. Never mind that they don't have Twitter completely banned, And so what the NBA did was what all these companies do when they get punished by the CCP. They bow and scrape and beg for forgiveness and promise never to do it again.
So they're saying 1.4 billion Chinese people were offended by a tweet in support of Hong Kong protesters who are seeing their freedoms impinged upon by the policies of the CCP.
Correct. But that's not true, of course, because they don't have Twitter in China.
Not only that, it doesn't make sense.
And it doesn't make sense. But anyway, the NBA eventually, then they got dunked on by Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke and any politician who wanted to be tough on China, right? And this is like in DC, it's like very good politics to be tough on China. I'm really tough on China. And NBA, how dare you kowtow to the Chinese Communist Party and, fire Daryl Morey and apologize and blah, blah, blah. And my reaction was like, wait a second. Why are we expecting the NBA to deal with the Chinese Communist Party? That's not fair. They're not a foreign policy organization. They don't know what to do. They're not powerful enough.
And they probably don't understand the dynamics.
They don't understand. They learned, but once they were in the soup, it was too late.
Right.
And they eventually course corrected, but they're still trying to repair all that damage. And
how did they course correct?
Well, they issued a statement expressing support for Daryl Morey's right to free speech. But then they issued a statement in Chinese that was less supportive. And then they, paid their penances and tried to maintain the relationships in China and tried to move on. But my point is that, that's how the CCP operates. They will ruin your business for the slightest offense. This happened 2 weeks ago with H&M and Nike.
And it's because the business is tied to China, because China does do business with the NBA.
Huge business. And
you think that this is it because China enjoys having the NBA as an entertainment entity, or is it
Chinese people love the NBA?
That's what it is.
The NBA is huge in China. It's also, if you think about it from the NBA's perspective, that's their growth, that's their future.
Right.
That's their biggest growing market for everything from jerseys to games to you name it.
And with a lot of sports, that's the case too.
And with Hollywood, and with the stock market, and with Silicon Valley tech companies, and with American universities, all of the sectors of American society see the China as a huge lure, as well they should.
And they do edit films to appease the standards of the Chinese party.
Self-censorship is the business.
Right, but there's certain things they do, like in Doctor Strange, the Tibetan master was replaced by an Anglo-Saxon woman.
Yeah. This is my Tibetan face mask, and now this episode will never be aired inside mainland China. Did I just
now? Well, I think it's probably already not going to be aired because of all the shit you said.
Yeah, that too. But now this will really seal it. Okay, and good. You know what I mean? I that's not to say we shouldn't engage the Chinese people. We need exchanges there, and this is another sort of conundrum of the U.S.-China relationship that I try to take a stab at in my book, which is that we have to engage with the Chinese people. We can't decouple our economies. We can't live in two different worlds. It's not going to work.
Right.
But we have to find a way to live with China, and we have to convince the Chinese government to find a way to live with us in a way that doesn't compromise our security and our prosperity and our public health. In other words, while we would love, it's not about regime change. It's not about a Cold War. These are sort of like figures that people throw out to dissuade people from having an honest conversation about how to deal with a Chinese Communist Party that is becoming increasingly problematic in ways that affect our lives. And what I'm trying to say is that, we have to be clear that, this is not about China or the Chinese people. This is about the party. This is the way that the party operates. Do you think that so there's that company that was airing the NBA games? They're making a lot of money off of that. They didn't want to stop airing the NBA games. They had to do that because of the parties. When Nike, what did H&M do? They put up a statement questioning whether or not the cotton they were getting from Xinjiang was made with forced slave labor. Just so hey, we're going to look into it. For that one statement, their entire business in China was crushed. Okay. Same thing. For years, they resisted. These companies, again, I get it. The cotton that you're sending us, was that picked by forced labor slaves? Are we allowed to ask? Is it okay? Just for that, Nike's business was destroyed inside China. Propaganda campaign.
How so was it destroyed?
They literally create they do boycotts. And again, it's not like here you can boycott something, but you have to convince people. There, it's like if the government says there's a boycott, right? And your company can't sell anything in China, and that's 40% of your business. You're fucked. It's a pretty incentive, right? And none of these companies are powerful enough to stand up to the CCP on their own, which is why I think they have to work with the U.S. government in some sort of way, but that's not really going on because politicians just want to dunk on the companies or they want to criticize them for not doing the right. So positive incentives to say to the NBA, hey, listen, why don't we, get together on this? We'll use our diplomatic pressure and our diplomatic tools to make sure that American companies and industries don't get punished by the party for bullshit like the tweet. But we're not sophisticated enough in our discussion of China or in our government response to China to actually make that happen. But I think basically where we have to go, and which brings up inescapable question, which if Nike's using slave labor for their shoes, why are sneakers so expensive? What's the overhead?
It's a very good question.
How are sneakers $150? But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
What would they cost if you paid people well?
Exactly.
Yeah. And what's happening? Is it just greed, profit margins?
Yeah. So anyway, this is a long way that the parties, to understand China, you have to understand that the party is in control of everything, and that dealing with that is just the way things are now. And that doesn't mean that we have to have a Cold War or that we have to decouple from China. It just means we have to figure out a new way to first try to convince them not to do the worst things, and then second, to protect ourselves if they insist.
One of the things that's confusing to people is that this was never a narrative a decade or 2 decades ago. This is a fairly recent discussion that we're having about China. China is an innocuous, just an enormous country with a lot of people just 2 decades ago. Nobody thought about this at all. They didn't think about China as being the incredibly influential superpower that had its, particularly its tentacles in terms of business, like how much business they own, like during the pandemic, there's been a lot of purchasing different stocks and learning how much China has bought percentages of companies, right? That's another thing that's happened during the financial crisis.
Yeah, well, I mean, so this is I get this a lot because, there's a group of China hands. These are like the old guys who have been managing, I would say, mismanaging the relationship since 1962, since we had our opening, right? And what they'll say is that, what are you talking about? This is a new problem. We've been dealing with this for 40 years. And we had these extensive plans of how to deal with China, and some of them worked, some of them didn't. And then China went a different way. And I get that. That's the discussion inside the China hand community, old gray beards, kind of like ivory tower kind of guys, all of whom I know, right? But I'm not that. I'm not a China hand. I'm just a journalist, right?
Right.
But what I say to that is that, yeah, that's fine. But like, first of all, how's that going? You know what I mean? You're the hands managing the relationship. How's that looking right now? And then secondly, what I say is, it's clear that this has to be a discussion that has to be had by all Americans, because no longer does it affect just the China watching community. Now it affects all of us. If you're sitting in your house, if you haven't seen your grandmother in a year, if you're worried about getting sick and dying, instinctively, and we can debate how much, but that some of that is because of the decisions and policies of the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, what happens in Beijing doesn't stay in Beijing. And, now that they're intentionally interfering in our politics, our sports, our music, our Hollywood films, our stock markets, our Silicon Valley tech companies, and our academic campuses, we have to get more people into this conversation. That's what I'm here to do today. There will be millions of people who have never thought this much about China, and I'm trying to engage them honestly. You know what I mean? I'm trying to convince them not to think what I think, but to educate themselves and join in the constructive discussion about how do we deal with this shared problem. And that's a very difficult discussion to have. And it's I haven't Washington. Washington is so fucked up right now. But I saw that discussion happening on campuses and inside Silicon Valley tech companies and inside law firms and inside the government. And the problem was that all these discussions were siloed. And then when the FBI comes knocking at your university and says, hey, we got to take a look at all your China research, universities are like, fuck you, because in America, our institutions guard their independence fiercely and rightly, and they're not trying to get the FBI to help them. But on the other hand, this is a problem they kind of need the FBI's help for. That, again, a level of sophistication that just not at, and hopefully the book is meant to sort of bring everybody to some sort of base level of understanding of the problem that we're dealing with, about the solutions.
When you're going over the information and you're writing a book like this and you have all this data that you just spilled out, and do you feel like a man without a country in a lot of ways? I don't mean a literal country. I mean in terms of like being connected to a group of people that see your point. because you're stepping out there in sort of in violation of both ideologies.
Well, I mean, in a way, I think that I'm putting a voice to a lot of things that a lot of people have been talking about
For sure.
privately for a very long time. And there's, first of all, inside the government, these were a lot of issues that people were wrestling with, and very honestly, in many cases, even well before Trump, it just didn't get talked about. A lot of the reasons we've already discussed. Can I get it?
Yeah. Give me that mug.
Oh, this mug has
one of them empty.
Look at that! You got my brand too.
Buffalo Trace.
You ever drink the Eagle Rare?
I don't know.
It's like one of the sub Buffalo Trace
Cheers.
brands. All right, now we're talking.
Yeah, I feel like this conversation's getting heavy. We could use a little booze.
Oh, that's the stuff.
Yeah. This is it's
Can I answer your question?
Please. Yeah.
Nobody cares about me. I'm just a guy doing his job. Okay. I'm like they're attacked sometimes. It doesn't matter. Nobody gives a shit about whether or not I'm in a team or not. I'm just trying to do my best to report the story, to do the reporting.
Yes.
And I'm not the only one. There are more and more people. So yes, for a while, people like me who were doing reporting, again, difficult things to talk about. Chinese influence in our schools. That's a complicated thing. It pits two American interests against each other. We want academic freedom, but we also want,
funding for research.
Yeah, and I get the tough thing. There are more and more people every day.
What is the influence in the schools? Where?
Three types. Okay, so one is just money, so much money. I'm talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of donations. And if you think that money isn't corrupting, then you're a fool. Okay, and when you have a school take $200 million to build their law school, and it's all from a Chinese Communist Party linked billionaire, that school is not putting out research criticizing the Chinese ever. Okay, they've just bought that school. Okay, and the way that they do it is through a network called the United Front. And the United Front dates back to Maoist time. And it's still referred to as striking the party's enemies by using the party's friends. And the United Front system in China is part of the party. It's baked into its DNA. And what they do is they lord over the party's interactions with anyone in the party. Now, some are in China, some are overseas Chinese, and some of them are foreigners like us. And the way that they do that through proxies. And what they do is they set up like 100 all over the world of these proxy figures and organizations, which launder the money, billions and billions of dollars into institutions, hand over fist, all day long for years and years and years and years. And no one ever knew it, kept track of it. Now people could keep track of it like a little bit, but not really. Like the Trump administration tried to for these universities to report on their foreign funding because they're supposed to by law report when you get a certain amount of money. None of them were doing it. They found all sorts of bullshit, all sorts of corruptions. So that's the number one way they do it is they take billions of dollars, they give them to their proxies, which are like Hong Kong billionaires or Malaysian billionaires or whatever. Somehow they find it's Thai billionaires, somebody who has an interest in doing business with the party and has billions of dollars. Somehow they find their way onto American campuses in all sorts of crazy ways. Okay, there's a really good story about this in the book about UT Austin. We're in Austin that I'm not even gonna tell you because I want people to buy the book. There's a UT Austin story in there. It'll blur out how they tried to use Chinese Communist Party money to fund the China Center at UT Austin. Some of the professors were like, wait a second, because these were China professors, and they were like, wait a second, is this an idea? And it became a huge scandal inside the school, and the Washington congressional offices got involved. I got involved. I wrote a column about it, and they rejected the money. And that was like the first time they had ever done that. And this Chinese influence operation that was targeted at UT Austin at the LJ school was thwarted. But that would never have happened a couple of years ago because people weren't even discussing it this way. That's a real example. So that's one. The other one is through Confucius Institutes. Do you know what these are?
No.
So, there are language and cultural learning centers implanted inside the world, hundreds of them. And I joined the Confucius Institute at GW just to see. I wanted to see if there was any corruption there. And I'm an alumnus, so I signed up. You could just sign up for I audited Chinese 101. I'm like, let's see what's going on. And so, as part of the reporting for the book, and I I took Chinese 101, and guess what? There was no malign Chinese influence in the Chinese 101 class. We're just a bunch of people learning Chinese, a bunch of college kids. I went to the reception, like the bar that I used to hang out at when I was in college. I'm 20 years later. I'm the 40-year-old guy at the bar. And they come up to me and they're like, Mr. Rogan, why do you want to study at the Confucius Institute? And I just looked at them. I said, education is a lifelong endeavor. That was it. Because I didn't want them to know that I'm trying to squeeze out the foreign influence in the Confucius Institute. Anyway, that one was fine. Other universities, it's a different story. They use the Confucius Institutes to plant spies. You don't have to plant them in the GW one because Washington is full of spies. It's true. You put them anywhere. You can't swing a dead cat without hitting a couple spies in Washington. Really? They're everywhere. Everywhere.
Do you just assume when you're talking to people that they could possibly be spies?
Well, I mean, they're not. Some of them are really easy to spot. You know what I mean? Like the Russian guy with like the belt up to here and like the white patent leather, loafers. Who's like, oh, Mr. Rogan, you're here at this bar too? Oh, let's go have a drink. You're like, okay, I know you, man.
Do you drink with them anyway?
Fuck yes, absolutely. I had a lot of good times hanging out with spies. There's this one Russian guy
about them sending you text messages, like we were talking about the Pegasus before the podcast outside. About the
my phone is fucked, by the way. The Chinese already heard this podcast before. It's totally compromised. It's true,
for sure.
There's a whole story there too.
Why don't you get a new one?
I did. It's at the hotel. I haven't loaded all the apps on it yet.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, no, I was calling my wife.
You shouldn't load any apps on it.
That's the new. That's what I'm going to do now. I know.
Yeah.
I was calling my wife, and then a guy from the Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency on the phone instead of my wife, and he didn't know why he was getting my call, and I didn't know why I was calling him. And it happened like 3 different times. Whoa. And then I tweeted about it, and everyone was like, oh, that's super weird. But I never really figured it out.
Why'd you tweet about it?
I thought
like
that
something I would want to investigate privately before
I wanted
put that out to the GP.
Get the Homeland Security Department to check it out.
Right.
And so I was like, if I tweet about it, they'll have to. I thought it was the U.S. government spying on me. I don't think that anymore. I don't think that's happened because they checked it out. They found out that I was actually talking to a Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency person. I actually did, like, they found that guy. His name's Sidney, but he didn't know why he was getting. And they don't really at that agency anyway, so it didn't really make sense.
So what do you think was going on?
Someone's fucking with my phone. I don't know. Somebody is. I don't know who.
Well, after this conversation, I can imagine why people are fucking on.
Yeah, no, I mean, it comes with the territory. But there was a Russian guy I used to hang out with all the time, and we were like, before I was married, we used to smoke Russian cigarettes and just like eat steaks and drink all the time. And I don't have any secret. I don't have any clearance. I can hang out with whoever I want to hang out with. That's the fun of being a journalist. One time the FBI came knocking on the door. They're like, Mr. Rogan, have you seen this man? And it's like my buddy Andre. Like
Andre.
I was like, no comment. And they're like, well, we just want to let you know that we think he's a Russian spy. I'm like, noted. Goodbye. I just hightailed it out of there. So yeah, that's.
What's the difference between Russian cigarettes?
They're like take off the filter.
Yeah, Camel.
Probably y'all vibes keep it rolling. 6 on 10, been zoning. Self-made in the game, can't control me. They know niggas snapping, you floating. I know when that shit gon' pop, get it open. I decline no time, stay focused. Money only thing attractive at the moment. Shit real and I'm here, keep it on me. Just some real hoes, I don't do the smart talk, look at Donnie. I ain't gotta say a word, niggas know me. Baby, I'm all night, I'm zoning. Talk came off float in the ocean. Billboard and Quan make it bolder. I don't really keep it true, niggas cloning. Screen 4L, 2Ls, and I'm folding. Hard to transition, but you do it when you chose it. Any locate, any might turn golden. It ain't hard to tell who really got it and wrong. Daughter got the rights to my site, she her own. She gon' need at least $100 for one rolling. I can't have a kid, still kin with the homies. How this young get coming out my city and they notice. Tell me what the deal right now, what's the deal right now?
We have like a case of it.
Tell me how I feel, I don't know, but it's real right now. Yeah. Think I got a deal right now, but they here right now. Yeah. Long as niggas know, still do it for the city.
Yeah. Hey yo, what up?
Big town come up, boss can't son us, run up, get done up. The niggas out, nut up. I fuck up the game, I put skills high on. Let niggas climb up the hills that they die on. Tryna fake bar, nigga try on. Me, I'm more Luka, more Zion. Was in the loop, had a chance, make them feel it. Supposed to be the next Bond. Turn Mike Carter Williams. Now it's no shot, cause the magic we've been dealing. So I try my best to feel it. I can't feel it, cause we know you niggas. Real life, give a fuck how it sound to them. Draymond's niggas happy they around shooters. Click thorough as it get, never sound foolish. Never kept the saber, call it way if it's down to it. Shane youngin' off the curb, off a towel coat. Tia had the braids, Granny in the green 5-0. When a nigga tell you that I do it for the city, I ain't coming on no lame shit or care about no gang shit. It's for that same youngin' moving like me. Got 100-something visits and they doubt it like me. Some niggas think whatever, but about it like me. Heard so many talk to hustle, but we're counting like me. And with the sharks stood firm like me. You gon' need some fucking nuts, you gon' do it like me.
Oh yeah.
Tell me what to do right now.
Oh yeah, academic. You wanna go back to that, or you wanna go for Russia?
Tell me how I feel, I don't know, but it's real right now.
No, you're a guest.
Think I got a deal right now, but they here right now.
I don't know any other way to do it.
As long as niggas know still do it for the shit.
I have no choice. I have no choice.
Tell me what the deal right now. Deal right now. Yeah. Tell me how I feel, I don't know, but it's real right now. Yeah. Think I got a deal right now, but they here right now.
Believe me.
Yeah. As long as niggas know still do it for the shit.
Okay, so American universities, right?
Yeah.
So here's a great example of like, you know, a really tough problem in U.S.-China relations, which is that like, we want Chinese students to come to America, right? Not just for the schools to make a bunch of money off of it, but because that's a key way of, you know, having our societies not fall into these silos where we can't deal with each other, which is terrible, right? At the same time, there's a threat there. Because once they build these Confucius Institutes, oh, by the way, there's a lot of corruption in the Confucius Institutes. Then they tell you that you can't have the Dalai Lama come to your campus because they're going to offend 1.4 billion Chinese people. That's a really example. And then they have these student associations, which are linked up with the con. And what they do is they like monitor the Chinese students. So if you're a Chinese in America, you still don't have free speech because everyone's watching everybody. And if you say the wrong thing, boom, you're on the next plane back to China and your whole family is fucked. Okay, so then we have like, oh, well, when Chinese students come to America, should we protect them? Should they be able to say what they want? Or is that none of our fucking business? On the other hand, you know, if we put big barriers up to these Chinese students, you know, aren't we becoming the thing that we hate? Aren't we becoming the thing that we're fighting, which is a closed society that's like that treats people from outside badly? Like, I can't go to China right now. The last time I went to China was 2016. There's no way I could get a visa at this moment. All the Washington Post reporters were kicked out even before, you know what I mean? Right. So we don't want to become the thing we're fighting. We have to, the best way to compete and with China is to be the best version of ourselves, to make sure that our model is the attractive one. And the way that we do that is, in my opinion, is by living up to our values and by being decent and tolerant and pluralistic and open and free and democratic and standing up for human rights and the rule of law and all those things that we profess to believe in. Not that we've done a great job of it. Like, I watch your show, you have plenty of people who point out all the flaws in that history. I agree with that. Yeah, mistakes were made, but nevertheless, that's our argument to all the countries in the world, because what they're doing is they're exporting that authoritarian model, not in the exact same way, but the technologies and everything, to any despot and dictator in the world who will purchase it. You know, and so that's the grand struggle. It's not really about the U.S. versus China. It's about free and open societies responding to China's rise where it affects us. And because Trump, this got framed as a U.S.-China Cold War. But the honest way to talk about it is an international response to China's actions as it rises. And that response requires dealing with all these other countries, which have different interests. But there are cases where the interests overlap, and there are cases where our values overlap, and we have to take advantage of those overlaps in order to join together to, again, combat the biggest country in the world that's run by a mafia organization. Okay, and these are very, very complicated things to think about, and that's where that discussion again is not really happening. Despite all you get is like, you know, China bad, and then don't say bad about China, you're a Cold Warrior, and that's like the level of the discourse, and it's crazy, and it's really it's the opposite of what we need, and that's sort of like where I'm at on it.
Is it possible that the recognition of this issue, and especially when it relates to American institutes of higher learning, could allow them to understand the whole in the logic of having these sort of closed ecosystems where they have this. There's echo chambers in American institutions of higher learning now. I mean, so many universities are they're not liberal in the sense of like what we originally thought of as they're leftist, and because of that, they won't even entertain opposing viewpoints or have debate, which is very dangerous. And it's also and this is not to say that you should support those other ideas, but you've got to entertain them and debate them and squash them with better logic. And if you don't do that,
if you don't have the space to do that,
the simple, lazy way to handle it is to stop it and to pull fire alarms and to yell at people and to not have people that have opposing viewpoints and don't allow conservatives on your campus. But I think it's really dangerous, and I think it opens us up to more manipulation. Right? If not just China, but whatever foreign entities are, and we know they are. We know Russia's doing that with the Internet Research Agency. They're manipulating our biases, and they're aware of them, and so they're using our own struggle that we're having internally with free speech and with open discussion and honest debate. And they're reinforcing the idea that it's a good thing to stop this stuff and to squash it.
And we're proving them right by acceding to their yes, exactly.
Yes. I'm hoping that the silver lining is we recognize that one of the reasons why the First Amendment is so important, it's we need to figure out who's right. And the only way to figure out who's right is to listen to who's wrong and to have the person who's right debate the person who's wrong. And let's find out where the facts are. And let's also agree to disagree occasionally. Isn't that okay? I mean,
constructive disagreement.
It's not anymore. It's country now. If you are in any way conservative, you're a Nazi and you're a racist and you're a terrible person and you're against history. It's like, that's not the case. There's a lot of people that are fiscally conservative but socially liberal. And there's a lot of people that I think I am as well. I'm certainly, there's a lot of me that leans towards, like, I understand human nature, right? And this is one of the reasons why I'm a big proponent of the Second Amendment. I don't understand why people don't understand that there's times where you can defend yourself with a firearm. And how's that when you see people saying that, oh, if you are in favor of the Second Amendment, you're in favor of mass shootings, you're in favor of horrific acts of violence and crime against people. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the reality of human beings. Like, these ideologies, the problem with them, specifically in this country, is that you get lumped off into camps. And if you don't agree with one side,
it's teams.
Yes. And
factions.
Chris Rock had a great bit about it years ago about gangs. That you're in a gang, you're in a liberal gang, you're in a conservative gang, and he's right. It's like he did a great job of putting it into comedy, and Chris does an awesome job of doing that with a lot of subjects.
Sure.
But with that in particular, it really resonates today because people don't have the time to research like you've done with China, or like many people have done with many subjects,
right?
And really find all the nuances. And find all the things that are uncomfortable to discuss, like you're discussing with all the things about COVID-19, like the things you're discussing about the CCP and their influence and all these different businesses and entertainment. And there's a lot of people that don't have the time to do that. So when you start criticizing in any way China, they equate you to racist. And don't you understand about the anti-Asian American hate that's elevated in this country right now? And it's
a tragedy.
It is a tragedy, but it's a tragedy that's held up by our education institutes.
Correct.
And that's the biggest tragedy. They're supposed to be the people that rise above this. But inside their own institutions, there's these echo chambers. And these echo chambers, they want to reinforce what they've already been pushing for all this time, and they don't want to open the idea.
There's a reason, right?
Yes.
So first of all, I agree with everything that you said. We're to the word, but the way that hits me when I filter that through my own intellectual prism is that the incentives are driving people into those things. In other words, why are journalists on team Trump or team Democrat or team scientist? It's because that's the incentive that results in their success in their careers. That's the human nature.
Yes.
The corporations have the incentive. what's their incentive? To make money for their stockholders, not to defend human rights for the Uyghurs, right? The colleges, their incentives are not to get sued, so they have to create all these crazy safe spaces and the such, right? So if we build our incentive system to drive people into the teams, and then we're like, why is everybody on teams? And then isn't that fucking up our own discourse? Well, it leads me to the conclusion that, okay, well, maybe we have to change the incentives. And, when you talk about like conservatives and liberals, again, I think the only reason that people even listen to me on this topic, if they do, I hope they do, is because I'm criticizing Trump and I'm praising Trump. That messes with their minds, right? I'm criticizing the CCP, but I'm not a conservative. I'm, a center-left Democrat. I always have been. I never, preach about it because it's not relevant really to the U.S.-China relationship in any serious way. But, I've been doing this for 17 years. I never, joined the conservative media because I never joined the liberal media because I didn't believe in either of that shit. I think my basic premise is both sides are fucked. Right. And both sides are corrupt in their own ways. And by the way, as a journalist, if you're criticizing both sides, you get double the stories. Like if you can pull that off, if you can source on both sides and criticize both sides, then you get double the credibility. That's not, again, I'm not perfect. I haven't always done that perfectly. I'm sure I have my own source bias. I've made mistakes. But that's how I think about it. So you have to think for yourself, first of all. And the only way you can really do that is if you're not bound by your incentives and your paymasters. Yeah. So, if you work for an organization, like, remember all those conservative newspapers that are like, organizations were like, oh, Trump's terrible. And then they switch like, Trump's great.
As soon as you want.
Fucking hypocrite. How could you do that? How do you look at that and then look at that and not realize that you just exposed yourself as a
right? And there's
hypocrite.
Also this weird badge of honor that you're a never Trumper, Republican.
Right. What does that even mean? Like, there are a lot of, if you read the book, there's a ton of stuff that the Trump administration did right on China. Okay. Yeah. Not Trump really, to be honest, because he was kind of a what's the correct word? Moron, I guess is the word. In other words, that he, I don't, not to be too unfair to him, a fool. And like, there's a story in there about how the coronavirus is like the news is coming out, and people like Pottinger, the guy I told you about, and other people are like, hey, Trump, listen, this is bad. We got to get on top of this. It's not, and Trump's like, well, okay, let me talk to Mick Mulvaney. He's like, no, it's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. He's like, okay, I've got two competing sets of advice. And he talks to his good friend, Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping, what does he tell him? February 6th, March 26th, 2 calls, exclusively reported in Chaos Under Heaven, where he says, hey, listen, Trump, it's going to be fine. It goes away during warm weather. Herbal medicine will treat it. We've got it under control. Lies. Coming from the Chinese president to the American president directly. And 2 days later, Trump is saying, oh, yeah, don't worry, it's going to be fine. Many people are saying it's going to go away in warm weather. He didn't say that many people were saying was his good friend Xi Jinping, right? He believed Xi Jinping. That had a horrible effect on our policy and on the health and safety of millions of Americans. But that's what happened. That's not a good story for Trump. At the same time, I'm prepared to argue that there are lots of things that the Trump administration did to reset our conversation on China that the Biden administration is continuing for a very good reason, because they make perfect sense, right? So what we're missing from our conversation is nuance. And yes, constructive disagreement is a huge part of that. But I don't know enough about American universities and how to solve that. But I do see something inspiring, actually, which is that when I started speaking to a lot of these college students about these issues, and you know what I found, which surprised me, actually, is that they get this. Okay, and you know I'm 42 years old. You know, like I don't have my finger on the pulse of what's going on inside Generation Z community, admittedly, but I've talked to enough of these students to say, no, we understand that genocide against Uyghur Muslims is bad, and we can't stand for it. And
that's probably the biggest. That's the biggest. That's an issue. Yes, as it ought to be. But that's the issue that really gets people concerned with what is actually happening over there.
Good,
because there's a lot aware of that.
Right.
And then they see some of the stories that are coming out about these people being shipped off into camps. They don't know where they're going, and they're like, what's happening here? Are we on the wrong side of history with this? In our urge to not appear racist and to not criticize China because of that, we might be allowing this to happen by being silent.
Well, the whole world is allowing it to happen, has been allowing it to happen, and it's still happening to this day.
What is what is their motivation for doing this to these people?
To destroy the Uyghur national, cultural, religious identity.
And these are Muslims that are in China.
There are some of the Muslims. Now, keep in mind,
Uyghur Muslims is what they're targeting specifically, though, no?
So in this region of China, it's a very resource-rich region that has been ruled by different elements of Chinese leadership over the course of hundreds of years. There resides a rich tapestry of ethnic minorities. Now, the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang are the largest of, like, let's say, 12 million out of 20 million people in this particular province, right? And you know what started and many years ago was slow but steady encroachment upon their rights and their freedoms. Okay, and then this took its form in a number of different ways. But what really made it sinister was not the camps. Actually, it was the mass surveillance, monitoring, and persecution that happens before you get to the camp, before you even knew there was something called a concentration camp in Xinjiang. You know that every move of your life is monitored. They took the technology, the AI and the facial recognition, which was developed in part with American tech companies quite willingly, and then funded by Wall Street, by the way, American investor dollars, funneling to the companies that are building the cameras that sit atop the streets that can spot a Uyghur by their facial recognition, so that the police can come down and tell you what's what. And these people were living in an open air prison before there were ever concentration camps. Now, then the destruction of hundreds of mosques, then all of a sudden, all of the journalists and leaders and thinkers and musicians and artists and political leaders disappeared, right? That was before the camps. And there were a lot of people like, wait a minute, this is pretty fucked up. Then
they don't know what happened to those people. They don't know if they're imprisoned or murdered. They have no idea, right?
Some were confirmed to be murdered. Some of them are still in prison. Most of them, you have no idea where they are. gotta relate this. Anyway, so then the camps. Then they came up with these camps, which are like, I mean, listen, I get that there were a couple of terrorist incidents, but imagine if, we had a couple terrorist incidents here. And I'm not saying we treated Muslims well after 9/11. We did not. I have many Muslim American friends who were treated horribly and continue to be, actually. And that's a stain on our country and our society. But we didn't build indoctrination camps and put 2 million Muslims in them. Yes, did we do that with the Japanese in a sense? Sure, yeah. But let's just deal with this for 1 second. And there's a ton of just like really horrendous, pernicious genocide denialism. And that's what the Chinese are pumping out right now. The Chinese Communist Party, rather. No, these are wonderful centers. Look at this video of these people singing a wonderful song. They're very happy here. Everybody loves it. And it's all bullshit. And, what I did, in the course of writing the book, is I interviewed a bunch of survivors. Okay? Because whatever statistic you have, and the legal definition of genocide is a determined thing. And it says that the intent to destroy a group of people in whole or in part. Okay, and now there's two key things in there. One is the destroying in whole or in part, and the other is the intent. So what a lot of people will say is, well, we don't know their intent. Maybe they're just fucking with the Uyghurs because they fuck with everybody, or maybe that's just like now concentration camps are the way that Chinese do business, and that's horrible, but it's not genocide. But setting the legal definition aside, what I decided to do is interview a bunch of the survivors. And their stories are true. They're not lying, okay? And their scars are real. They didn't invent their scars that they showed me. And their stories are harrowing. And just for a couple examples, just to paint the picture, we have this thing called Radio Free Asia, where you have like people broadcasting news in other languages. It's paid for by the U.S. government. It's a little bit, basically a lot of journalists, trying to do their best to report news to other people around the world. Some used during the Cold War, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were a key part of like convincing the East Germans that they had a better life awaiting for them. They could just throw off their ship. Anyway, skip ahead 50 years. The 26 journalists, Americans, mostly Americans, who work for Radio Free Asia in Washington doing reporting on this, they were some of the first to break the news of the camps. Some of it we saw from satellites. All of a sudden there's a grass field, then there's a huge camp, right? Looks like a prison, acts like prison, walks like a prison. It's a prison. And these journalists, 26 of them, every single one of them, all their family members were scooped up and put into the camps. All of them. Americans. Their fathers, their mothers, their aunts and uncles disappeared. They never heard from them again for the crime of reporting on the camps. Okay? So that's one thing. They target anyone who refuses to shut up about it. Then I met this young woman named Vera Zhou. And Vera Zhou was a 20-year-old, she's not even Uyghur actually, she's Hui Muslim. And she was a student in Seattle at University of Washington. And she goes home to visit her dad in Xinjiang, and she logs onto her VPN to file her homework for college. They have like a University of Washington virtual private network. 3 hours later, we're going to need you to come downtown. What happened? Just come with us. 3 hours later, she was in handcuffs. 8 hours after that, she was in a camp. Okay. So an American resident, Chinese national, 20-year-old young woman, sophomore in college, never heard a fly, not a terrorist, not even a dissident, just trying to go to college, trying to do her homework. She spent 5 months in the camp. The story is awful. But then that was only the beginning of her nightmare, because then she got let out of the camp for an interesting reason, and she couldn't leave China. So she was stuck. They wouldn't give her passport back. Spent another 2 years in China. Waiting for them to get her passport back. They finally gave it to her. She came back to Seattle. Her credit was fucked. She lost her apartment. She had been de-enrolled from her school because she didn't, pay her bills or attend the classes while she was in a camp. And the University of Washington didn't lift a finger to help her. And her whole life was fucked up, for the simple crime of pressing click on the VPN once. That's a capricious form of abuse, and, that's not even getting into, the next stage. So then you've got the open air prison that is Xinjiang. Then you've got the camps. But wait, you get out of the camp. Your nightmare is just beginning, because now you got to go to the factory. What factory? Shut up. Just get in the car. We'll take you to the factory. Now you're picking cotton or sewing together Nikes. You can leave the factory, but you can't go home. We're going to pay you so you're not a slave, but you don't have a choice. You better show up at that fucking factory. And that's your life now. What about my kids? Well, what do you mean, what about your kids? Well, when I went into the camp, I had a newborn baby. Well, that, we had no choice. We had to send that kid to an orphanage somewhere, and you'll never see him again. Sometimes, maybe you will, maybe you won't. Some of the people got the kids back, some didn't, right? And then there was another woman who I interviewed who said when she was finally let out of the camp, they're like, oh, we have to give you a medical check. And they put her under, and then when she woke up, they're like, okay, you can go now. They'd given her a hysterectomy. Okay? So,
holy shit.
This is mass forced sterilization and mass force abortion, all these things. Okay? Now, people will quibble about the data. I'm saying I've talked to humans who this happened to, they're not lying. I looked into their eyes, they're not lying. And there are many, many stories. And that's the thing about it's the same. I hate to use this analogy because it's like God wins law, but like when you think about the Chinese government sending, this is a real example, a boat with 17,000 tons of human hair. 17,000 tons of human hair from Xinjiang. Okay? And, do you think that hair was given over willingly by a woman? Do you think they were properly compensated for that hair? Because the ones I talked to said they didn't get a dime for the hair that was shaved off their head that got put on a boat and sent to California. And, when the Trump administration, again, something they did right, had the audacity to say, no, we're not going to take that human hair and we're not going to put it, it's not really an issue for you, by the way, but like most people didn't want to once they know that the hair was shaved off the concentration camp victims' heads, they don't want to put it on their heads. You know what I mean? That's because, in essence, Americans are good people. Once they're aware of these atrocities, they don't want to be complicit in them. And we turned back that boat that had the 17,000 tons of human hair, and then the Communist Party went crazy and punished the companies and, sanctions, you Cold War crazy Hawk Pompeo Americans, what are you doing to us? You guys are all racist. That's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with, do you want to put the concentration camp hair on your head? Do you want to put the forced slave labor cotton on your back? And to be honest, like most Americans had no idea, right? And they're like, okay, well, now that I know that, and then some of them, after they learn it, they still won't care. Some of them will say, that's not my problem. That happens over there. That's not over here. But what I'm saying is that if you believe in sort of the idea of human dignity, the path of the Enlightenment, liberty and democracy and human rights, and people can choose what they want to do and choose who they want to worship and choose who they want to love. These are the things more than geopolitics matter to human beings at their core. Then these things, these actions can only be described with one word, and that word is evil. Okay, and that word evil is a big word, and it deserves some justification. It deserves some explanation. At the same time, it's kind of a word that we can't live without for some reason, because when we see it, it's so clear and it's so stark that we have to call it out.
How far does this extend in terms of businesses? Like, so much of what we buy today is manufactured in China, including Apple products.
Well, that's one thing. So a lot of these companies are realizing that they've become corporate hostages of the CCP, and that's a tough calculation for Apple. I'm not insensitive to the bind that they're in.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, I don't think there's any easy solutions. But what everybody misses actually is not. That's one part of the problem. Forced technology transfer. You hear a lot about IP theft and trade subsidies and all the things that were part of the trade war, by the way, which was not, a whole nother subject. But that's not really the way that we're supporting. That's not really the problem. The problem is that hundreds of millions of Americans are unwittingly funding all of these malign Chinese companies passively through their pensions and investments and indexes and other, Wall Street mechanisms. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the biggest transfer of power and wealth to these malign Chinese companies and to all Chinese companies comes from Wall Street, comes from American firms who have been drastically increasing their involvement, assistance, and holdings of these Chinese companies, including the ones that build the concentration camps and the cameras that sit atop the concentration camp walls, and the companies that sell the cotton, but also the companies that build the missiles that are put at us, and the companies that are doing the spying of our cyber hacking. And if you just think of that just for 1 second, and there's like a chapter about this in my book, but this is like the bleeding edge. Now we're getting to the bleeding edge because we're getting to like the real shit here. Okay, and the real shit is that hundreds of millions of Americans your pension, everything is, you don't manage that. That's not like invested. That's most people. I don't know about you, but for me, I trust my pension to whoever's running that pension. Now, if you knew that that pension was increasing its holdings in these malign Chinese companies, you would think, oh, wait a minute, now I'm invested in the success of these companies. And of course, from the Chinese side, that's exactly what they want. They want to build a constituency inside of our society such that, you know, again, to put Americans to a choice between interests. Oh, wait, if we sanction Hikvision, this is a real example. They make the cameras that, like, it's amazing. Their cameras are amazing, right? They can search through a crowd and find the Uyghur. That's the Uyghur, okay. But if you don't care about that, it's just a great camera. Wall Street is pumping money into that company, left, right, and center. Now, the U.S. government is sanctioning that company. But what's the point of sanctioning the company if Wall Street's going to come in and fund it times 10? It doesn't make any sense. It's crazy. But that, just what I've just said there, is also like too hot for TV. People can't wrap their minds around it because they're still trying to figure out, you know, about the IP theft and the trade subsidies or whatever other bullshit that we've been talking about for the last 20 years. But these Wall Street firms, rather than wake up to the sort of challenge that we're in and have an honest discussion about how to mitigate the risks. Again, we don't want to decouple. We don't want to say we can't invest in China. We need to do business in China. We should do business in China. At the same time, there've got to be some limits. There's got to be some points where we say, okay, well, maybe the company that builds the cameras that sit atop the concentration camp walls, maybe that's one we shouldn't, pour Americans' money into. And by the way, once 100 million Americans are invested in that company, it's going to make it a lot harder to sanction that company because they're going to have a constituency. You know, they're tying our financial interest to their political interest. Again, it's not for the benefit of China; it's for the benefit of the party who wants to do a genocide against Muslims. That's not really economic interest. That's the party doing its evil shit.
Jesus Christ.
That's interesting, right?
It's not. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
Because it seems like it's impossible to decouple.
We shouldn't decouple. We just have to figure out where the lines are. And, you know, the big reveal is that this effort to sort of change China is not going to work. It wasn't going to work. It shouldn't be our job. It's hubristic, right? All of the, the restraint crowd people, all of the libertarians out there who are like, oh, this is just another, scam to have the military-industrial complex have an excuse for endless defense budgets. Now we're going to have the new Cold War with China. That's going to be the thing we're going to spend all of our trillions on to replace Afghanistan, right? I hear that a lot. I get that a lot. But what I'm trying to say is I get that. But here's what I would say is that, the competition with China is really not a military competition, okay? So, yes, we're going to need some military stuff, but don't get too concerned. I mean, be concerned about the horrendous abuses of the military-industrial complex, which are real, but that's not the point of the China competition. It's an economic, ideological, and technological competition for most. And the real action is really in the markets. It's really in the capital markets. And Wall Street doesn't want to talk about that for very obvious reasons, because they're getting rich. Okay, and the press that covers Wall Street doesn't understand geopolitics, and the political press doesn't understand Wall Street, right? And all I did was try to connect those as much as I could in like half a chapter, which is incomplete to be sure. But that doesn't get us to anyway how we deal with it. And what the Trump administration tried to do is they tried to order these Wall Street companies to divest, and these Wall Street companies were like, "Fuck you," and that's an unsettled question. But I would just ask any listener or viewer out there, if you knew that your pension was tied to concentration camps, do you care? Does that bother you? Okay. Some people may say no, it's none of our business. But I say it bothers me. I don't want my pension being used to build concentration camps. That's just me. So that's what I'm going to try to argue against and try to affect change in if I can. So far, it's not going very well.
So what?
It's not.
I'm sure. So what about products?
Well, that's the other thing. Sort of like, it's what you said about the information hill. Like, people don't have time to climb that hill, right? So, like, does this shirt that I'm wearing, does this involve some slave labor? Maybe. I don't know. And I spend all my time on this shit. I still don't know. You know what I mean? I'm wearing Adidas right now. Is that there's some abuses in the product of those? Probably. So
what has Apple done? Has Apple done anything to try to mitigate this? And is it more morally sound to buy a Samsung product, or do they have the same sort of ties to China as well?
No company that does manufacturing in China is immune from the pressures. So what Apple did was they moved their cloud servers for Chinese users inside China, essentially giving up on the privacy of those Chinese users. They erased a bunch of Hong Kong apps from the App Store at the Chinese Communist Party's demand because they were helping the Hong Kong protesters figure out like how to, protest and against the for freedom and democracy. And so they're constantly kowtowing. And again, they're the example because they're fucked. They're in a hostage situation. One of the stories that hasn't even really broken out yet, that nobody even really talks about, is like when Apple wanted to change its privacy controls to give people that have actually more control over their data, all their Chinese partners decided to ignore that and build a workaround. In other words, you have 10 major Chinese tech companies that are producing content and apps for iPhones who are declining to follow Apple's rules. There's nothing Apple can do about it because if they protest, the Chinese Communist Party is going to literally, shut down their profit-making ability, and that's a huge, huge, huge business. So it gets to your decoupling question, which is like, okay, if we can't change China, and we shouldn't try because it's hubristic to think that they're going to become like us. China's going to develop in a way determined by the Chinese people, one way or the other. That's what 4 decades of U.S. military intervention failure should have taught us, is that we can't change these countries, okay? But what we can do is we can put them to a choice. In other words, we can say, okay, if you're insistent on doing this bad behavior, we're going to accordingly and change our behavior to respond. And that could be a mix, increasing the cost of the bad behavior. That's what tariffs are about. People will say tariffs are about lots of different things. They're really about imposing a cost on the Chinese industry so that it's harder for them to do business the wrong way. And then we're going to take measures to protect ourselves, which means some decoupling. It means we don't have everything here, but we better have some masks. You know what I mean? How about masks? Okay, well, nobody thought before 2019, what's the difference? We don't need mask factories. Why would you build a mask factory? It's 1,000 times cheaper to do it in China. Now, you don't have to make that argument. Everybody knows we're going to need our own fucking masks, right? Why? Because there's going to be another pandemic, and we don't want to have to bow and scrape and promise to shut up about Hong Kong and just to get our masks.
And the manufacture of medicines,
high technologies, semiconductors, components, stuff like that. 5G.
There's an issue right now with chips for trucks and cars and
all of that. Yeah, we don't produce semiconductors. Okay, well, that's what should we do about it? Well, let's have that discussion. We could build our own semiconductor foundries. That's one idea. We could fund them with the government. That's another idea. We could make partnerships with the Taiwanese companies. That's complicated. Okay, that's another good idea. These are all good ideas. None of them are actually progressing because we're all, talking past each other and, trying to talking about whether or not it's okay to say Wuhan virus. You know what I mean? That's the level of our discussion. So just this, as far as we've gotten in this time, it's way farther than I've ever gotten in my entire life talking about this stuff, to be honest with you. Because it takes 3 hours to get to the point, which is that, okay, we have a complex problem and good-meaning people who may disagree have to come together and come up with complex solutions. And all those solutions are imperfect, and they all require trade-offs. And if we get out of Afghanistan, that should give us a little bit more attention to focus on this. And maybe we don't need to have $80 billion of intelligence community shit pointed at jihadis in Yemen. We could take some of that and point it at some of these labs, because guess what? That's actually also very important. And because Washington is so broken after Trump, really broken. I mean, I've been there for 24 years, and it's always been sort of this functional, what I call functional dysfunction. Nothing worked the way it was supposed to, and but it kind of all muddled along. Budgets got done, and everybody was kind of equally unhappy, but equally happy. Trump smashed that, right? He flipped over the chessboard, okay? And you could say that needed to be done, but what he failed to do is set it back up again. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's what the Biden administration is charged with doing. And I think they're making an honest effort to do that, but they're also caught by their own politics and their own bureaucracy and their own infighting and their own bullshit, which is natural. But the reason that we the dichotomy of the book is that we had this awakening in American society to the challenge of a rising China, but the first inning was played by the Trump administration, and because they were such a mess, so it's called chaos under heaven. They fucked a lot of it up.
Now, when you say they fucked everything up,
no, not everything, just some of it.
Okay, they fucked it up and they broke it. Like how did they break it? Like what specifically fucked up the system that wasn't immediately reparable upon removing him from office?
Okay, so just take a look at the trade war, right? So Donald Trump, I read every book that he professes to have written, and a ton of them mention China, right? And a lot of them say the same exact thing: is that we got a problem here. The Chinese government has been taking advantage of our economy, and we need to stop. And and that's what he said in the campaign trail. He was determined to do that. Okay? And I understand the trade war was very unpopular, and even amongst Republicans, the idea of tariffs and all of this, trade stuff was like an anathema to like their core ideological belief system. Okay, I get that. But what you saw actually inside the government underneath was a genuine effort to find ways to convince the Chinese government to do something different. Okay, but the problem was that Trump was such a bad tactician, right? He had this vision of like fixing the thing, but he varied between different ways that he kept handing the trade experts. He handed it to Wilbur Ross, then Jared Kushner, then Steve Mnuchin, then Lighthizer, and then Navarro, and then and it was just such a disaster, policy and bureaucracy wise, that it had no chance of achieving its own aims. So he took this big shot at fixing the trade relationship. He didn't get shit. The phase one deal is meaningless. What's $50 billion worth of soybean sales when you have a $6 trillion pandemic and a $600 billion IP theft? You know what I mean? It's crazy. It's piddly. It matters to those soybean salesmen. Those guys are very happy, but it didn't actually solve any of the problems. And so that was a big missed opportunity right there, right? Same thing with you remember, did you follow this TikTok WeChat ban thing? Yeah. That was a crazy one because, again, once Trump realized that Xi Jinping had lied to him, his good friend Xi Jinping, who had chocolate cake, remember with that chocolate cake that we had at Mar-a-Lago, the most beautiful chocolate cake you ever saw in your life, and he really thought they were really good friends, and so he once he realized that was all bullshit and that actually they weren't friends, he turned on Xi Jinping and he unleashed his national security people to do it. The first thing they're like, we're going to ban TikTok, which is a weird hill to die on if you think about it, because it's TikTok. Like, I get it. Like, I don't have it because I don't want. I think there's definitely some risk there. We don't know how much, but probably not the number one China relations that we need to address. But anyway, they issued an executive order banning TikTok. Okay, well, that's a pretty serious thing. We're now banning Chinese tech companies. Okay, well, that's kind of interesting. We should do that pretty carefully. So he does that, but then he hands the negotiation over to Mnuchin, who switches the priority from banning TikTok to saving TikTok. And he tries to make a deal with Oracle and the Chinese company to IPO TikTok to make everybody rich. He takes it back from the national security people. And then the Chinese government was like, no, fuck you. We're not doing that. We're not handing you TikTok. That's our golden goose. You can't have it. And the whole thing, and then they sued us in American courts and the whole thing got kaflooey. So that's a good example of where they took a very serious issue and then totally screwed it up because of their own incompetence.
And the desire to make a profit.
Well, the national security people and the Wall Street people inside the administration fought each other and canceled each other out. They nullified their own, and both of them lost. And TikTok is. What
do you think about the Huawei ban?
So that's interesting. So again, for those people who don't know, Huawei is like the biggest Chinese telecom company there is. They're all over the world, and the Trump administration went around the world saying you can't. Hey, African country, South American country, you better not do Huawei. Why not? Well, it's a huge security vulnerability. Okay, well, what do you have to offer us in its place? Well, nothing. Oh, okay, well then fuck you. And then, the Chinese come in, they're like, hey, they don't come in and say, would you like to buy Huawei? They say, hey, would you like to get rich? And would you like to have your dictatorship absolved of any war crimes in the UN, and we're going to build you a house and a soccer stadium, and then we're going to give everybody in your country phones and for free, and then we're going to give you a 5G technology that's going to make your economy go whiz at 30 cents on the dollar, and that's it. Happy birthday. And these dictators are like, yes, please, I'll take that. That sounds good to me. And then here comes like Mike Pompeo is like, oh, you better not do that. USA is going to be very angry with you. They're like, okay, well, we care about that too, but we're going to take all of the money and corruption and all this shit that the Chinese are offering us. So it's a great example of sort of, and then of course Trump changes his mind about it all the time. So it's another great example of how they took this important issue and they brought it up to the fore rightly, drew a circle around it rightly because it is a risk, but then bungled it in the execution. And so now it's just like a mess that the Biden administration has to clean up.
And there really is a significant
Here's one more thing.
Risk.
Sorry.
Oh, please go.
So there's there's a million examples, but like this is what you have to understand about the CCP, is that it's never just one thing. For them, it's all connected. Okay, it's all connected on their side. So they go into a country, and like China Mobile, this is a real example. They went to Ethiopia and to Addis Ababa, and they, you want telecom infrastructure? Here you go, 30 cents on the dollar. The technology is great, by the way. Don't let them tell you that the Chinese tech is crap. It's not. It's amazing. They've done amazing things with engineering, and they're very, very skilled engineers. And so all these people get their phones, and they're like, all the phones, these people never had landlines, and all of a sudden they all got cool cell phones, and cell phones are loaded with a game. And what's that game? Oh, well, the game is poker, virtual poker. Okay, well, there's $100 on here. Oh, I'm going to start playing virtual poker. They all start playing virtual poker. Of course, they all lose a bunch of money, and then all of a sudden, knock on the door comes, it's the local Chinese gang come to collect. Okay? Now, what does that tell you? It's a question.
I don't know.
It tells you that the Chinese telecom companies are working with Chinese gangs who are working with the Chinese government.
So
they work in Hong Kong.
So they come to collect because you lost money. So you don't have it connected to a credit card?
Once they connect it, once they are bought in, and once there's a debt to be paid, that debt is collected by a different Chinese organization. That's not a company. It's a criminal organization. No, what I'm trying to get to here is that the CCP works with the actual Chinese gangs. In Hong Kong, the triads, which are like the Chinese gangs, beat up the protesters, right? Why are they doing that? Why are the Chinese gangs acting on behalf of the CCP to beat up Hong Kong protesters? It's because they're working together. The Chinese Communist Party and the actual criminal gangs are as close as lips and teeth, as Matt would say. Am I getting?
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to get to here is that this is a complex problem because on their side, they're mixing all of these things: industry, politics, criminality, diplomacy, bribery, corruption, development. All of those things are part of their strategy, which is very organized and marching apace. And we don't think about it that way. We're attacking different tentacles of the problem. But until you realize that actually it's all one big problem and it's all connected, then you can't think about the way appropriately.
Well, it's organized and inexorably connected to the party.
Exactly.
So there is no business without the party.
Exactly.
And so we are at a significant disadvantage.
Correct.
And there's no acknowledgement of it nor solution.
I mean, there's some acknowledgement of it, but the solutions are, I haven't seen that.
But even the Huawei ban,
yeah.
I mean, the Huawei's just been banned in the United States and not allowed to use Google. But what that's allowed them to do is start their own, I mean,
sure.
It might be even worse. They started their own ecosystem.
Right.
And
it's inevitable.
And their own ecosystem, I'm sure, is like way more porous and susceptible to,
right.
Yeah.
So you got to go to these countries. If we were smart, what we would do is we'd go to these countries and say, listen, do you like your cell phones with spying or without spying? Now, I know it. A lot of the listeners are going to, doesn't the NSA on all shit too? Yes, we spy. Yes, we're guilty of this stuff too. I'm not excusing the U.S. government's abuses, okay? And believe me, I spent years and years reporting on the U.S. government's abuses. Just because I am a Washington guy who reports the Washington Post, I'm against U.S. government abuses, okay? So again, two ideas in our head at this time. The U.S. government can abuse its spying powers, and the Chinese government can abuse its spying powers. But basically, it's not the same. And if you build an AT&T or a Verizon network, or if you build a Huawei network, those two things are not the same, okay? And both of them have vulnerabilities. But I'd rather have the non-Huawei network. But these countries would also rather have it because they know that once they get bought in, once they take the bribe, once they take the corruption, once they take the package, that's it. They're sold. There's no going back. You can't untangle yourself from that. They would, in many cases, prefer to work with us if we had something to offer. In other words, we can't just bash China. That's not productive. We have to have an alternative that's based on our values, that's based on rule of law and, free commerce and, companies that, are less susceptible to government spying. And we're not doing that. But if we had a more proactive, more aggressive, counter, that would help. That would help a lot.
But it seems like there were so many steps behind. They didn't anticipate any of this.
Some people did, but those people were ignored for many, many years. And the Trump administration, in a way, was a chance for those people to have their voices heard. And that's why you saw so much change in U.S. China policy that you did. Unfortunately, those people also had to deal with Donald Trump. And so that's why it got all screwed up. Again, I think the Biden administration, to their credit, is thinking about these things very hard. They want to understand what are the things that the Trump administration did that were good, what were bad, but they're taking a while, and the Chinese Communist Party is not waiting. They're actually speeding up their plans. If you look around the world, what did they do during the coronavirus pandemic? They invaded part of India. It's a pretty fucked up thing to do. It backfired, right? Because the Indians are now more anti-CCP than they ever were. They're aggressive against Taiwan. They did horrible things in Hong Kong. I mean, horrible things. And they increased the repression of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, by the way, and the Inner Mongolians and anyone else who didn't shut up. And so they're speeding up now that we're sort of attuned to it more. They're speeding up their plans, and our response has to speed up as well.
This is such a fucked up subject because
kind of, yeah.
What I'm looking at, if you're watching this play out, I don't see like a real good way out of this.
Well,
I don't see a way where they don't have some pretty significant influence on us, even more so than what they have now over the next decade or two.
How does this end?
How does this end?
I don't know.
But you have to be pretty fucking, having written this book and having researched this for that long, you got to be pretty concerned.
Yeah, yeah, I spent a lot of time on this, but there are a lot of people. How does this end is a really interesting question, because again, there are some people who say we have to bring down the CCP right now, like Steve Bannon, and Peter Navarro and these guys, and they're like, okay, well, listen, if this is the reality, then we got to bring those guys down right now. I don't think that's
possible.
It's not, and we shouldn't try. But this is what some people will say, and what I say is that we have to figure out a way to have a relationship between the rest of the world and China that both sides can live with to avoid the conflict that neither side wants. In other words, people think the Cold War is the worst scenario. No, it's not. Cold War is not a good scenario.
Hot War is the worst.
Exactly.
Scenario.
Thank you. That's the worst scenario. So the question is, how do we avoid that? Because that's actually the worst thing. And I argue, and many people like me argue, that the best way to avoid it is by confronting this problem now, by addressing it now. That the more we let it fester, that the more powerful and expansionist and aggressive and repressive the CCP gets. And guess what? It's all going in that direction. But according to all of the evidence and everything we see, the more dangerous this situation becomes, because their appetite grows with the eating. Okay, and the more powerful they get, the more they tell us to go fuck ourselves. And so we have a amount of time to prove to them that we actually do desire a world where they can have their country. It doesn't mean we're going to shut up about their atrocities, but it means that what we're concerned most about is what their actions are in our countries. That the real fight against the CCP and the competition with China begins inside of our own borders, in our schools, in our markets, in our Silicon Valley tech companies, in our sports, and in our movies. And that's where we have to focus the most of our efforts. Then we have to join with our allies and partners, specifically in the region, who are facing the same problem that we are. And so that's how this ends, is that, in the best case scenario, is that we convince the Chinese Communist Party to limit its ambitions such that we can all live together and avoid the hot war. But ignoring the problem is not a strategy. And history shows us that when you face expansionist, totalitarian, pseudo-religious dictatorships, inevitably they keep expanding and they keep gaining until confronted.
What's the worst case scenario?
The hot war.
Okay, outside of the hot war, is there another scenario that you could see that also would be similarly worst case in terms of like what they've done to Hong Kong?
They change the world to be safe for autocracy and repression. In other words, they compromise us and are so powerful that we can't stand up to them, that we lose what Christopher Hitchens would call our way of life.
That's what I'm concerned with. I'm concerned with
we live in a society
become them to confront them.
That's a terrible scenario too.
But that's a scenario that's likely.
Yeah, I mean, let's hope not. But yes, when you see, that's why we have to stand up against things like self-censorship in our own society. That's when Daryl Morey tweets something, everybody who believes in the Enlightenment and individual liberty and the path of human dignity has a responsibility to say, no, fuck you. We can tweet whatever we want, and they have to learn that we're going to tweet whatever we want, whether they like it or not. And they can't tell us not to, because that's the slippery slope where we're okay, well, we can't have a China studies program that talks about Tibet. It already happened in Hollywood. When's the last time we saw a Hollywood movie about Tibet? It's been about 20 years. 20 years. I haven't seen one. What's Richard Gere doing? He's the guy's out of work.
Right.
There's a reason. So are we going to and there will become a tipping point where we're so invested in these Chinese companies that sinking them, even if they're committing atrocities, will sink our own economy. So that we have to figure out what we have to protect, where we have to decouple, and where we don't. You know, and there are plenty of places where we don't. You know, that's fine. We should encourage interactions, and we should keep, you know, our shared essential oneness. You know, like there's something just true about the fact that we're all humans share some sort of commonality, even people in China. Are you on Clubhouse at all? Do you ever do Clubhouse?
I did it once. I thought it was ridiculous.
You didn't like it?
No, it's a podcast for people that don't have a podcast.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's why I like it. I don't have a podcast.
With podcasts that jump on there. And I'm like, when do you talk to your kids?
That's true. But, you know,
yeah.
I found it to be a refuge during the quarantine because I could connect with people that I couldn't meet with.
Oh, that makes sense.
So for me, it was a pressure release valve. But the point is, this is crazy. For like 6 weeks, it wasn't banned in China. And there were thousands of people from mainland China on the app talking with Tibetans and Ai Weiwei and Hong Kongers and dissidents and Americans and in Chinese. And what I witnessed is that they actually we're not all that different. You know, actually these people want the same things that we want, and they are not stupid. They're not brainwashed. They understand their government. They know what they're dealing with. They might think about it differently than us. They're not as critical of us. They don't know everything. There was this one woman who didn't know about the Xinjiang concentration camps, but she learned about it.
Were you speaking to her in Chinese?
She was in English. I was in the English rooms. I don't speak Chinese.
Okay, you only speak Japanese.
No, but there were a lot of my friends who were Chinese speakers were in these other rooms, and we were having this crazy community of people who were coming together, and then the Chinese Communist Party shut it down. And
so they shut it down in China, and you can't even get it through a VPN?
There's some people who have found out tricky ways to get through the firewall, but they do so at great risk, because what we then found out is that Clubhouse is built on Chinese tech.
Of course it is.
It's not encrypted. And their servers are all from a Chinese company.
Oh, Jesus.
And those people may have gotten scooped up, and I pray for them. I'm not religious, but...
Really?
Yeah, we're pretty sure that you know, all the conversations could have been monitored. All those people were put it, and then when they shut down the app, the people who were still left were like, "Oh my God, Clubhouse, what have we done? We might have just gotten ourselves, you know, ruined our whole lives." And you know, Clubhouse didn't do shit, as far as I can tell.
Well, it's still an invite-only app that's in kind of a beta form, right?
Anybody can get an invite. I can get 20 invites right now. It's not as exclusive.
Well, anybody like you.
No. I'm telling you, it's a false exclusivity. It was early on, but now it's like basically anybody can join. But my point is that if you engage with Chinese people, good things happen, and we need to somehow preserve engagement without succumbing to the party's rules and edicts and doctrines. And that again is a very difficult thing that I'm not prepared to like give you the perfect solution for at this moment.
Dude, you freak me the fuck out. This is
mission accomplished.
Super uncomfortable conversation.
I thought it was really productive. I felt good about it. I got a lot off my chest.
Well, I know you did, and it really was very productive in a lot of ways. But it's also.
And I settled my score with Dan Ninen, which I've been waiting a decade to do. You have no idea.
Dan Ninen in some way introduced us. That's how I found out about you. Like when you know you were pitched to be on the podcast, I'm like, oh, that guy. Yeah, I remember that story.
All right.
And then I read all the rest, and I was like, oh, okay.
Everything happens for a reason.
Yeah, maybe. Fuck, man.
Anyway, another reason to drink.
Yeah. Salute. Cheers.
Cheers, man.
Well, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. How long did we go? How long?
It's like 3 hours.
Jesus.
Yeah, but I'm not gonna sleep well. This is a fucking reoccurring problem.
Can I leave on a note of optimism then, in order to cheer you up a little bit?
Sure. You have optimism?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, this struggle for human dignity and individual liberty is universal. It dates back to Descartes and Spinoza and Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and Orwell, and will continue in future generations. In other words, the long arc of history does bend towards justice, and that, you know, despite how bleak it looks now, in the end, people do want those things. Our offer is better. People don't want to live on their knees. People don't want to be chattel of the party state. People want to think for themselves and love who they want. That's better. If you ask any person, even any Chinese person, who doesn't have a minder standing over them, they'll choose that thing.
Yes.
So if we keep that idea in our mind, then we don't have to worry about if you're Republican or Democrat or American even. It doesn't even matter, because this is a universal truth that human dignity and individual liberty and rights are things that we all must strive for and that we all have a responsibility to advocate for. And that if we keep focused on that mission, then we can take the politics out of this and we can join in our shared humanity and make some progress.
That sounds awesome. But how do you get a country that's under the grip of a totalitarian party, under a regime that does have supreme control, under a regime that is more than willing to commit genocide and force people into slave labor? How do you convince them that that's not the way to go, especially when they have ultimate control and it's been insanely profitable and the power that they've amassed is unprecedented? In terms of like the ability to control what's kind of a capitalist society, it's kind of capitalist, right? It's not communist, but you know what I'm saying? It's not communist in a traditional sense where they've taken away all the incentive. They've allowed people like Jack Ma to amass billions of dollars. It's a weird sort of hybrid. It's like a virus that's evolved.
The only honest answer is I don't know.
I don't know either.
To be continued.
To be continued. The book's available right now, ladies and gentlemen. It's called and non-binary folks. Chaos Under Heaven. Josh Rogan. Thanks, brother. Appreciate you, man. Let's have you in again. Let's do this more often.
Anytime.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Is your internet slow? Upload speed sluggish? Video calls?